Montana Territory, December 1879. The train never came. Snow fell thick and slow over the desolate stretch of track outside the small, wind-bitten depot in Red Elk Junction. Lantern light flickered through the warped windows, casting long shadows that danced across the cracked wooden floor. Lena Abernathy sat on the bench farthest from the stove, knees drawn to her chest, her gloved hands clutching the carpetbag that held all she owned. Her coat was too thin, her boots soaked through. She had not spoken in hours. The ticket master had already gone home. No one else waited, just her. The wind howled outside like a thing alive. She blinked against the sting in her eyes, but the tears were not from the cold. "Madam?" She looked up fast, startled. He stood in the doorway, snow piled on his hat and shoulders. He was tall, broad across the chest, with a weather-worn face and kind eyes that were the color of dark earth. A rifle was slung over his back, but his voice was soft. "No train tonight," he said, stepping inside and shutting the door behind him. His boots thudded heavy on the floorboards. "Tracks iced over past Billings. They said it'll be tomorrow." "Maybe." Lena looked down again. Her voice cracked when she tried to speak. "I cannot stay here." He saw the shake in her hands, the way her lips trembled. He stepped closer, his brow pulling into a frown. "You been out here long?" she nodded. "Since this morning." He crouched in front of her, close enough she could see the flecks of snow melting on his eyelashes. "Name's Paxton Price," he said. "I have a place not far, just a cabin, but it's warm, safer than this." She did not answer. "I will sleep on the floor," he added, quiet. "You'll have the bed, I swear that." Lena studied him then. His voice held no edge, no hint of danger, just calm honesty. She had heard enough lies in her 23 years to know what truth sounded like. Still, she hesitated. "I will bring you back before sunrise if you want," he said. "But if you stay here, you'll be sick by morning." Something in her cracked. She stood, legs stiff, and nodded once. He took her bag without asking. Held the door for her like she was a lady, even though her gloves were worn through and the hem of her skirt was in tatters. The snowstorm swallowed them. It was a slow, silent walk. The wind cut through her clothes, but Paxton kept beside her, steady and unbothered. He led her past the edge of town, through a grove of stripped birch trees to a squat cabin tucked against a slope. He opened the door and stepped aside. Inside, it was warm. A fire glowed in the hearth. The smell of cedar and coffee hung in the air. Lena stood in the doorway, unmoving, until he gently touched her back. "Come on in, miss." She crossed the threshold. He hung up her coat beside his, then moved to stoke the fire. "You sit. I will make you tea." She lowered herself onto the edge of the cot, her fingers still trembling. Paxton poured hot water into a dented tin cup and handed it to her. She held it tight, letting the warmth seep into her skin. "My name is Lena Abernathy," she said after a long pause. He glanced at her, then nodded. "You from the East?" She nodded slowly. "Philadelphia. What brought you out here?" Her jaw tensed. "My husband died last spring," she said. "Consumption, left nothing behind but debts. I sold my wedding ring to pay for a train west. My sister was supposed to meet me in Helena." She swallowed. But she never showed. Paxton sat down across from her, arms resting on his knees. "And you waited all day, hoping she would." "I did not know what else to do." He nodded like he understood that feeling. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then nodded. He made stew from what he had: beans, salt pork, and potatoes. She ate slow, careful. He waited until she set the spoon down before speaking again. "You have people back east?" "No one left." She stared at the fire. "I was a governess before I married. After he passed, no one wanted me back." 23 and widowed is as good as ruined. Paxton's jaw flexed. "You are not ruined." Lena looked up. His eyes held no pity, Just quiet strength. Later, she stood in front of the hearth, drying her skirt. Paxton laid a quilt over the cot and turned to the floor with a bedroll. "You sure about that?" she asked softly, nodding toward the cot. "I am," he said. "You need rest." She watched him settle on the floor, his back to her, his rifle within reach. She did not sleep at first. The wind battered the walls and her mind raced. But when she looked at him, this stranger who had offered her nothing but kindness, something in her eased. "Sometime past midnight," she whispered. "Thank you." He did not move, but she heard his voice. "You are welcome, Lena." In the morning, the storm had not passed. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of eggs frying. Paxton glanced back from the stove. Snow's still thick. Train will not run for another day, maybe two. She rubbed her eyes. "I should not stay." "You can," he said. "You are safe here." She studied him. The way he moved, quiet and sure. The way he looked at her, not like a burden, but like someone who mattered. She stayed. That day they talked more. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, how he came west after the war, how he built the cabin himself. He showed her the scars on his hands from years of ranch work. She told him about her father's bookstore and how she used to read by the fire until her eyes blurred. By evening, she laughed for the first time in months. He smiled when he heard it. The snow kept falling. The next night, when she lay in his cot again, she turned to face the fire. "Paxton," he lifted his head. "How long have you lived alone?" He hesitated. 6 years. "Why?" He exhaled slow. "I never found someone I trusted." She stared into the flames. "I know how that feels." They did not speak again, but something shifted between them. By the third day, she was no longer shivering, and when he caught her looking at him while he chopped wood, he smiled, slow and warm. That evening, he brought her a book from a shelf above the hearth. "I figured you might miss reading." She ran her fingers over the cover. "Thank you." By the time the train came again, neither of them wanted it. She stood on the platform, carpetbag in hand, coat buttoned. Paxton stood beside her, silent. The whistle blew in the distance. "I should go," she said, but her voice wavered. "You could stay," he said quietly. "There is a warm bed here, and someone who would be real glad to see your face every morning." She looked up at him. The train slowed, brakes hissing. She took a step back. "I want to stay," she whispered. Paxton reached for her hand. "Then stay." Their fingers laced, and for the first time in a long while she did not feel lost. The sun rose slow and pale over the edge of the hills, casting a faint gold light through the frost-laced window panes. Lena stood near the stove, her hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cool, watching Paxton string a new line of wire along the fence just beyond the tree line. His coat was heavy and patched at the shoulders, his gait even and sure as he moved across the frozen ground. She hadn't meant to stay longer than the storm demanded. But the snow had melted in patches now, and still, she remained behind her. The kettle hissed low on the stove. She turned from the window and poured fresh water into the basin, the steam rising around her face as she dipped a cloth and wrung it out. Her fingers ached from the cold, but she didn't mind. There was a rhythm to the days here that steadied something in her. Paxton returned just after midday, his gloves stiff with ice and the brim of his hat dusted white. He stamped his boots at the threshold and hung his coat by the fire without a word, his eyes meeting hers as she handed him the cloth to wipe his face. "You fixed the west line?" she asked. "Tight enough to keep the mule from wandering again," he said, scrubbing the grime from his neck. "Though I reckon she'd rather be in the barn than out there nosing around snow drifts." She smiled faintly and set a tin plate on the table. He sat across from her, his forearms braced on the wood, hands still red from the cold. "You always work alone?" "Mostly," he said. "Used to ride with a partner years back. He took a bullet near Miles City and went south after that." Never cared for the cold. Why'd you stay? Paxton looked down at his plate, then back at her. There's quiet here. I've come to need it. Lena nodded once and let the silence stretch between them, not awkward, just easy. The wind knocked softly against the shutters, and outside, the mule brayed once, then fell quiet again. That evening, Lena sat on the porch step with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the last of the light slip behind the ridge. Paxton joined her, his presence solid beside hers, neither of them speaking for a long while. "Been thinking," he said finally, his voice low, "about setting up a smokehouse come spring. I've got the tools for it, just never made the time." She turned toward him. "What would you use it for?" "Elk mostly. Maybe cure some trout if I can get decent netting. Dry enough days it'd keep through the summer." She studied the angle of his jaw, the way he kept his eyes on the trees ahead. "You plan far ahead." "I didn't," he said. "Not for a long time. But now I don't know. Feels like there's room to." Lena rested her hand on her knee, fingers tapping a slow rhythm. "I used to plan everything. Timetables, letters, savings stitched into coat hems. It never amounted to what I thought it would." He looked at her then, something unspoken in his gaze. "It still could." Inside, the fire crackled. A hawk cried out far above the pines. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. The next morning, Paxton saddled his gelding before dawn. Lena helped him pack the canvas bag with dried apples and bread, tying the flap with careful fingers. "Won't be long," he said, leading the horse toward the trail. "Just need to check on a neighbor's shed up north. Roof was sagging last I saw it." She watched him adjust the rifle sling across his back. "I'll tend the fire." He hesitated, then stepped close, his words quiet. "If the wind picks up, bolt the shutters." She nodded. After he rode off, Lena moved through the cabin with a quiet purpose. She swept the hearth, mended a tear along the bottom of one curtain, and folded the wool blankets at the foot of the cot. Her hands never stopped, but her thoughts wandered to the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. The way he always left a portion of food on his plate, like he was used to feeding someone who never came back. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in low and heavy. She stepped out to gather wood, glancing down the trail with a hush of worry in her chest. But when she turned back toward the shed, she noticed something she hadn't before: a carved notch in the doorframe where someone had marked the passing of seasons. 4 tall lines and one across, repeated in sets. Years counted quietly, one winter at a time. She brushed her fingertips over the last mark, only half carved. The blade must have slipped before it was finished. When Paxton returned near dusk, his coat was soaked through and his cheeks wind-burnt. She had stew waiting on the stove. He peeled off his gloves and took her hand before she could retreat. "I thought of you," he said plainly. "Out there." She felt his thumb skim across her knuckles, rough and warm. "I thought of you too," she whispered. He didn't let go, and she didn't pull away. The days unfolded slow, like thawing creek ice, each one pushing winter further back without entirely letting it go. Lena stood barefoot near the open door, brushing ashes from the hearth rug as the scent of early earth drifted in, muddy, sharp, and full of promise. The ground was softening, and the first shoots of wild onion had begun to push up along the lower slope behind the cabin. Paxton was outside, fitting a new hinge to the chicken coop. She could hear the occasional scrape of metal against wood, followed by the low creak of the door swinging open and shut under his hand. She watched him through the glass pane, the way he leaned slightly into his work, jaw set, shoulders steady. He hadn't shaved in a few days, and the stubble had darkened along his chin, catching the light when he turned his head. She stepped out quietly and walked toward him, the hem of her skirt brushing damp grass. "I was thinking," she said as he straightened, wiping his palms on his trousers, If we plant beans near the back fence, they'll catch more sun come July." He glanced over, then nodded. "Soil's better back there, too. Might be time to dig it out while the frost's loose. I can help. I know you can." She didn't flinch like she once would have, waiting for some correction or dismissal. His trust in her had grown quietly, like moss along stone, unspoken but sure. They worked through the morning, turning soil with old spades, her hands blistered raw by midday. She didn't complain. He noticed anyway, pausing to hand her his gloves without comment. She took them without thanks, because he didn't offer them to be thanked. Later, as she washed the dirt from her nails in the rain barrel, he leaned against the porch post, arms crossed. "You ever planted anything before?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "Books, yes. Gardens, no," he smiled, but not at her. More like something in himself had eased. "You learn quick," she looked over her shoulder. "I have reason to." That night, thunder rolled in from the west. The sky turned the color of pewter and the rain came heavy, drumming against the roof like hooves on hardpan. Lena sat at the table, mending a seam in Paxton's shirt where the stitching had come loose at the shoulder. She didn't ask permission to take it from the peg. He didn't stop her. He was near the fire, oiling the lever of his rifle, the scent of linseed thick between them. "You always keep it that clean?" she asked without lifting her eyes from her needle. "Saved me more than once," he said. "I owe it care." She set the shirt down. "Did you fight in the war?" "Didn't have a choice," he said. "Lost more than I kept. But I came out breathing. Must have been young, too young." The silence that followed wasn't uneasy. She returned to her stitching while the storm pressed against the walls of the cabin, but her hands moved slower now. "You ever think of leaving here?" she asked. "Once. Rode as far as Fort Benton. Thought about the riverboats, but I kept thinking about this place. The quiet. The way the wind sounds through the trees. I turned around before the last ferry left." She tied off the thread and looked at him. "I think you stayed because you were waiting." "For what?" She held his gaze. "Something worth staying for." His eyes didn't move from hers. "Maybe I was." She didn't look away. By morning, the storm had passed. The air smelled clean, wet pine and churned earth. A squirrel darted across the porch rail, and somewhere in the woods, a grouse called low and steady. Lena poured water into the kettle and stood at the stove, her hair braided back, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Paxton came in from the barn, shirt damp across his shoulders, carrying a sack of oats. He set it down, then reached into his pocket and held out a small, folded piece of paper. "I saw this posted near the livery in town. Thought you might want it." She unfolded it slowly. An advertisement for a traveling school, looking for instructors to teach reading and sums to ranch children in scattered homesteads. Her fingers tightened around the paper. "I thought you said no one would hire me again," she said quietly. "I said they were wrong not to." She looked at him, then down at the page. "I don't want to leave," she said. "Then don't." He picked up the kettle and set it on the stove without asking. "They'll need someone nearby, too. Folks out here have young ones. They just don't have the time to ask." She stepped closer. "You think they'll listen to me?" He met her eyes. "They'll listen." He didn't say he believed in her. He didn't have to. That evening she stood behind him as he sat on the porch, his hat tipped back, a pipe unlit in one hand. She rested her hands lightly on his shoulders and he reached up, covering them with his own. "I don't know what this is yet," she said. "I do," he answered. She leaned forward, her cheek against his hair. "So do I." And the wind carried the last of the winter off the ridgeline, leaving behind only the scent of warmed cedar and the slow, steady rhythm of two hearts no longer waiting. The first colt came mid-April, legs long and trembling, fur still damp from birth. Lena stood just outside the stall, sleeves rolled above her elbows, a lantern swinging low in her hand. Paxton knelt in the straw beside the mare, steady hands guiding the foal's awkward rise. "He's strong," he said, voice low. Lena crouched beside him, careful not to startle the mare. "You think he'll hold his color?" Hard to say. "Might lighten at the flanks once he dries out." The colt staggered upright, his breath a soft whistle in the chill air. Lena reached out and ran her fingers lightly across his neck. He didn't flinch, just leaned into the warmth. They stayed like that a long while, not speaking, listening to the quiet huff of the mare and the soft creak of beams overhead. Outside, the wind had settled into a hush against the barn walls. Back in the cabin, Paxton rinsed his hands in the basin while Lena stoked the stove. He watched her from the doorframe, her braid loose down her back, the hem of her dress smudged with hay and dirt. "You never asked me what I'd planned to do in Helena," she said, folding a towel and placing it by the hearth. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She sat beside the fire and tucked her legs beneath her. "I had letters from a man who claimed he ran a boarding house, said he needed help with the books and kitchen, promised room and board." She looked into the flames. "When I got to the depot, there was no address. No one by that name in the city records. Paxton didn't move. I think he was never real, or maybe he was and he just changed his mind." She glanced up. "Either way, I was a fool." "No," he said, moving to sit beside her. "You were hopeful." "That's not the same." She looked at him, not with doubt, but with something quieter. "You think it's foolish to hope for more than survival. I think it's necessary." They sat close, knees nearly touching. The air between them had a weight to it, not heavy but full. "I've been offered a place," she said. "To teach at the camp near the southern ridge. A woman rides out twice a week with her sons. She said they'd supply a wagon if I accepted." Paxton didn't look surprised. "You want it?" "I do, but it's a half-day ride." "I'd be gone from sunup to dusk." He nodded once. "I'll keep the stove warm." She smiled, just barely. "That's simple. I've lived alone long enough to know when something good's come to stay." She reached for his hand, calloused and warm. "You're not afraid I'll grow tired of this place?" "No. You don't settle for little things. I've seen it." She leaned in then, her forehead resting lightly against his. "I want to build something here, not just survive it. So do I." They kissed, slow and sure, like planting something deep in the earth. That spring, the rhythm of their days changed but never frayed. Lena rode out before first light, a folded cloth of bread and beans tucked into her satchel. Paxton would walk her to the edge of the grove and watch until she crested the ridge. By the time she returned, dusk curling gold across the hills, the fire would be lit and supper waiting. She brought back stories of boys who could barely hold a pencil, of girls who memorized poems faster than she could recite them. He listened, not with indulgence but with interest. She told him of a child who had never seen a book before. He told her of coyotes near the west fence and the stubborn mule who refused to stay penned. One evening in early May, she came home with a leather-bound volume tucked beneath her arm. "Where'd you get that?" he asked as she set it gently on the table. "A man's wife passed last winter, said she'd want it to be used, asked if I could read it to the children sometimes." Paxton brushed his fingers along the spine. "You will?" "Yes," she said. "And to you if you'll let me." He pulled a chair out and sat. "Start now." So she did. The words rose soft in the hush of the room, her voice steady, the fire casting shadows along the floor. Paxton leaned back, eyes closed, not asleep, just listening. And as the night deepened and the lamp burned low, Lena read on, her voice a thread binding the life they were building. A life neither of them had asked for, but both had chosen piece by piece, word by word, until there was nothing left uncertain between them. The last frost passed quietly, unnoticed except in the way the earth no longer crunched underfoot at dawn. The trees leafed out in soft green, and Lena began to leave her shawl on the hook by the door each morning. By late May, the garden rows behind the cabin had begun to sprout beans first, followed by radish and early squash. The soil, once frozen and stubborn, yielded now with ease. One afternoon, Lena returned from the ridge with specks of chalk on her skirt and sunburn high on her cheeks. She found Paxton at the workbench he'd built beneath the eaves, bent over something with a chisel in hand. "You're carving again," she said, brushing dust from her sleeves as she stepped closer. He didn't glance up. "Had an idea I wanted to try." She leaned in. "What is it?" He slid the piece toward her. It was a small wooden box, the grain dark and clean, the lid just barely ajar. Inside, nestled on a scrap of linen, lay a ring carved from bone, smooth and pale, the surface etched with a single band of tiny raised dots. She stared at it. "I know it's not store-bought," he said, setting the chisel down, "but I wanted it made from something I worked with my own hands." Lena reached out and touched the bone lightly. "Where'd you get this?" "Elk shed near the creek. Found it last season. Kept it, thinking maybe I'd use it for tool handles." He looked over at her. Didn't seem right in the end. Her voice was quiet. "You want me to wear it? I'd be honored if you did." She picked up the ring slowly, rolling it between her fingers. "I never thought I didn't expect anything like this when I got off that train." "I didn't expect you," he said. "But you came anyway." She slipped the ring on. It caught slightly at her knuckle, then settled. "It fits. I measured one of your gloves when you weren't looking." She laughed, short and warm, and then leaned in to kiss him, her hand resting over the curve of his shoulder. He didn't move at first. Then he reached up, fingers tangling gently in her hair, and pulled her in fully. They married 3 weeks later, beneath the spread of a cottonwood near the creek. The justice of the peace came in from Miles Crossing with a Bible and a flask, and the neighbor woman Lena taught for brought her 2 boys in tidy shirts. Paxton wore a clean collar and boots scrubbed nearly raw. Lena's dress was plain, but she'd stitched a row of forget-me-nots along the hem the night before. After the vows, Paxton kissed her once, then again, longer. The mule brayed loudly from the field, and one of the boys threw a pine cone in the air. Nobody minded. That evening they sat on the porch, watching the fireflies stir along the edges of the woods. Her head rested on his shoulder, and the air smelled of pine smoke and lilac. "I never told you," she said softly, "but I used to dream about a life like this once. Before I ever married the first time. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought dreaming about it might be the closest I'd ever get." He turned his face toward her. "You're not dreaming now." "No." She looked up. "I'm not." A hawk cried once from far off, and the wind moved gently through the tall grass. Summer brought more children to her lessons, and with them, more books. A man from Butte rode out with a wagon full of second-hand readers and left them all in good conscience, he said, "so long as you make use of them." She did. She taught them to read seed catalogs, to write letters to cousins they'd never met, to calculate how many fence posts they'd need if they wanted to pen in a new calf. Paxton built her a bench beneath the shade tree where the children sat in rows of 3. In the evenings, he told her how the colt was shaping up, how the beans were climbing faster than expected, how the west fence needed mending but not urgently. They ate supper side by side, elbows touching at the table, and sometimes he'd reach across without a word and tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Once, when the stars were out and the fire had burned low, she asked him, "Do you think we'll ever leave this place?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Only if we both had reason." She nodded slowly. "I think I'd rather build everything we need right here." He looked at her then, not like a man who was trying to understand, but like one who already did. I think we're already doing that." They kissed again, slow and certain, and when the lantern finally burned out, neither of them moved to light it. Years passed, but they came gently, like each season knew exactly how to follow the last. The garden grew wider. The roof was shingled a second time. Lena's lessons turned from counting to geography, then to Latin phrases she hadn't practiced since girlhood. Paxton repaired the barn door one winter without being asked and built her a shelf for herbs when her jars outgrew the windowsill. In time, a cradle stood in the corner of the cabin. Just one. They named her Ruth, after Lena's mother, and Paxton held her with the same quiet reverence he gave to every living thing he'd ever tended. Ruth learned to walk with her arms outstretched toward her father's knees and to read from the same reader Lena had first brought home in a leather strap. They never left the cabin, not once, but they built their whole world there, piece by piece, day by day, until it was full. Not grand, not easy, but full. And every night, no matter how long the day had stretched, Paxton laid beside Lena, one hand resting over hers, and she would whisper some small thing, the way the beans curled, or how Ruth had laughed in her sleep, and he would answer, not with words always, but just the weight of his hand, the warmth of his breath against her hair. They were never lonely again.